Have you ever watched someone you trusted destroy your reputation with a single sentence? Have you ever stood in a room full of people who had known you for decades and realized that not one of them wanted to hear your side of the story? And if that same person came back years later asking for forgiveness, would you even let them finish the sentence? It all started at what should have been one of the happiest family gatherings of the year. The house was full of laughter. My children and grandchildren were there. Cousins I hadn't seen in months were catching up, and the smell of homemade food filled every room. As I pulled into the driveway, I had an odd feeling in my chest. I sat behind the wheel for a few extra seconds, staring at the front door. I can't explain why, but something told me to leave. I almost did. Instead, I walked inside. For the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. People smiled, shook my hand, and asked how I'd been. But it didn't take long before little things began to feel different. Conversations stopped whenever I got close. Two relatives looked at me, then quickly looked away. Someone whispered my name, and the room suddenly became quieter than it had any right to be. I told myself I was imagining it. Then someone tapped a spoon against a glass. The conversations ended instantly. Every head turned toward the dining room. The man I had trusted for years slowly stood up. He took a deep breath, looked around at everyone gathered there, and said, "I can't keep this secret any longer." At first, I thought he was about to confess something about himself. Instead, he pointed directly at me. He told everyone that I'd secretly taken money from the Emergency Family Fund, a fund created to help relatives through difficult times, and that I'd hidden it for years while pretending to be the family's most generous supporter. For a moment, I couldn't even understand the words I was hearing. Then I looked around the room. No one laughed. No one questioned him. No one said, "That doesn't sound like you." Instead, I saw faces changing right in front of me. Confusion became doubt. Doubt became disappointment. A few people quietly nodded as if pieces of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. That's when I realized something that hurt even more than the accusation itself. This wasn't the first time they'd heard the story. Somehow, everyone already seemed prepared to believe it. I tried to speak. "I don't know what you're talking about." My voice barely made it across the room. He interrupted me before I could say another word. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "I knew you'd deny it," he said calmly. "That's why I brought proof." The room became so quiet you could hear children laughing outside through the open window. He slowly removed several papers from the envelope. People leaned forward in their seats. Even I had no idea what I was about to see. And in that moment, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a lie invented on the spot. Someone had planned this long before I ever walked through that front door. Every eye in the room was fixed on that envelope. No one was looking at me anymore. It was as though my guilt had already been decided, and those papers were simply the confirmation everyone had been waiting for. The man who had just accused me held up the first page for everyone to see. "I didn't want to believe it myself," he said, his voice heavy with rehearsed disappointment. "I kept hoping there was another explanation. If I hadn't known him for so many years, I might have believed him too." He slowly passed the papers around the table. The first person to read them was my younger sister. Years earlier, when her husband lost his job and they were days away from losing their home, I was the one who quietly paid their mortgage until they got back on their feet. I never asked for the money back, and I never told another soul. Now she couldn't even look me in the eye. Next came my nephew. I still remembered spending weekends teaching him to drive. Later, when he couldn't afford college, I helped cover his first tuition payment because I believed every young person deserved a chance. As he lowered the papers, the pride he had always shown when introducing me as his uncle had disappeared. Then the documents reached my oldest cousin. For more than 40 years, we'd stood beside each other through weddings, funerals, birthdays, and some of the hardest moments our family had ever faced. We had promised each other that no matter what happened, family came first. He didn't say a word. He simply folded his arms and slowly shook his head. That silent gesture hurt more than any accusation ever could. It felt as though decades of trust had vanished in the space of a few seconds. Finally, one of my brothers broke the silence. "What exactly are we looking at?" For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a small spark of hope. At least someone was asking a question. But the answer came almost immediately. Copies of bank transfers, he replied. Money taken from the family emergency fund over several years. Whispers swept across the room. So that's where it went. I knew something didn't add up. I can't believe he'd do that. Every sentence felt like another stone being placed on my shoulders. I stepped forward and looked at the documents myself. There were bank account numbers, transfer dates, dollar amounts. Even my name appeared beside several transactions. For one terrifying moment, I questioned my own memory. When enough people look at you as though you're guilty, your own mind begins searching for explanations, even when you've done nothing wrong. Then something caught my eye. One of the transfer dates. I knew that date. Not because of a bank transaction, but because it was the weekend of my granddaughter's college graduation. I had flown nearly 2,000 miles to be there. I still had photographs from that trip. Hotel receipts. Boarding passes. There was no possible way I could have been where those documents claimed I was. A rush of relief washed over me. I finally had something concrete. I opened my mouth to point it out. Before I could say a single word, he quickly gathered the papers back into the envelope. There's more evidence, he said, calmly sealing it shut. But I don't think everyone needs to see every page. That stopped me cold. If the documents proved everything beyond doubt, why wasn't he letting anyone examine them more closely? Why rush them past everyone's eyes? For the first time that afternoon, I stopped looking at the papers and started watching him. That's when another voice broke the silence. It was my oldest niece. She had barely spoken all afternoon. She looked at him, then at me, and asked a question so simple that no one else had even considered it. If this has been happening for years. She paused, looking directly at the envelope in his hands. Why are we only hearing about it today? The room fell completely silent. For the first time since he'd stood up, his confidence cracked. It lasted only a heartbeat. A tiny hesitation. A flicker in his eyes. Most people missed it. I didn't. Until that moment, everyone had been questioning me. Now for the first time, someone had begun questioning him. I didn't realize it then, but that single question would become the first loose thread in a lie that had taken years to weave. And once it started unraveling, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. No one answered my niece's question. The room fell so quiet that all I could hear was the old clock above the fireplace. Then he smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone caught off guard. It was the smile of someone who had already rehearsed this moment 100 times. I stayed quiet because I wanted to protect the family, he said. I kept hoping he'd come to me privately, admit what he'd done, and return what was taken. But he never did. Several relatives slowly nodded. His explanation sounded calm, reasonable, almost noble. That's what made it so dangerous. Before I could respond, my older brother looked directly at me. His voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than anyone else's. I need you to answer me honestly. He paused for a moment. Did you take that money? I looked him straight in the eyes. No. Not. I don't think so. Not. It's a misunderstanding. Just one word. No. I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. The man accusing me let out a long sigh, almost as if my answer disappointed him. I knew you'd say that. He reached into the envelope again. This time he removed several printed emails. I hoped I'd never have to show these. He handed them to my brother. From where I stood, I couldn't read a single line. All I could do was watch faces. My brother's jaw tightened. My younger sister read the first page and slowly lowered her eyes. This was the same sister whose mortgage I'd quietly paid years earlier after she and her husband fell behind on their bills. I never mentioned it again because I believed helping family wasn't something you kept score of. Now she couldn't even look at me. The papers moved to my nephew. I'd helped him buy his first used car, so he could keep the job he'd worked so hard to get. The excitement he'd once shown whenever he introduced me as his uncle had vanished. He folded the papers without saying a word. Then they reached my oldest cousin. For more than 40 years we'd celebrated birthdays together, buried loved ones together, and promised that no disagreement would ever come between us. He slowly pushed his chair a little farther away from mine. He never realized that tiny movement hurt more than any words ever could. "I want to see them," I said. For the first time all afternoon he hesitated. It lasted less than a second. Then he handed me the pages. At first glance they looked authentic. My name, my email address, conversations about the family emergency fund, even what appeared to be my signature. For one terrifying moment my stomach turned. Then I noticed something. Every email ended with the words, "Best regards." I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because I'd never ended an email that way in my entire life. For over 20 years I'd signed every email exactly the same way. Everyone who had ever exchanged messages with me knew it. Someone had copied my identity, but they hadn't copied me. I looked up, ready to explain. No one was listening. They weren't watching me anymore. They were watching him. He had become the voice they trusted, and I had become the man they pitied, or suspected. Then something happened that broke me in a way no accusation ever could. My youngest granddaughter quietly walked across the room. She slipped her tiny hand into mine. Her eyes searched my face. "Grandpa," she whispered, "did you really take their money?" It felt as though every ounce of strength I'd been holding on to disappeared at once. Not because she was accusing me, because someone had taken away the one thing every grandparent treasures, her unquestioning trust. I knelt beside her and gently squeezed her hand. "No, sweetheart. I didn't." She studied my face for a few seconds. Then she gave the smallest little nod. For a brief moment, I thought that was enough. Then her mother softly called her name. She looked at me, looked back at her mother, and slowly let go of my hand. As she walked away, she kept turning around to look at me, as though she wanted to believe me, but didn't know who she was supposed to trust. That image has never left me. Even now, years later, I still see that little girl walking away. I still wonder what she believed when she went home that night. As I stood there watching her disappear into the crowd of relatives, I finally looked back at the man who had started all of this. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at the family. He was staring toward the kitchen doorway. I followed his eyes. Standing there was another member of the family, someone who had barely spoken all afternoon. For just a second, they looked at each other. He gave the slightest nod. The other person nodded back. Then both of them quickly looked away. It was so subtle that no one else seemed to notice. But I did. And in that instant, a far more terrifying thought entered my mind. This wasn't one person's lie. Someone else in that room already knew the truth, and they were helping him bury it. I couldn't take my eyes off the person standing near the kitchen doorway. They didn't comfort anyone. They didn't ask questions. They didn't seem surprised by what had just happened. They simply stood there, quietly watching the room as though everything was unfolding exactly as expected. Before I could walk over to them, relatives began surrounding the man who had accused me. "I'm sorry you had to carry this by yourself. You were brave for finally telling us. You did the right thing." Every word of comfort they offered him became another sentence against me. I tried one last time. My older brother was heading toward the front door, so I caught up with him. "Please," I said. "Give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." He stopped, but he never turned around. "If those papers aren't real," he said quietly, "prove it." Then he walked away. Those 6 words stayed with me all the way home. Not because they hurt, but because they changed something inside me. Up until that moment, I had been trying to convince everyone I was innocent. Now I realized I was asking the wrong question. The real question wasn't whether I could defend myself. It was whether I could expose whoever had built this lie. I barely slept that night. Not because I was replaying the humiliation. Because I was replaying the mistakes. Every lie has them. Every plan leaves something behind. I just had to find it. Before sunrise, I cleared my kitchen table and grabbed a notepad. From memory, I drew the dining room exactly as it had been. The long table, the fireplace, the doorway to the kitchen, every chair, every person. Then I asked myself one simple question. Who already knew what was about to happen? I started writing names. My brother, My sister. My cousin. My nieces. My nephews. One by one, I remembered their reactions. Most had looked confused. Some looked shocked. A few looked heartbroken. Those reactions couldn't be rehearsed. Then I reached the last two names. The man who had accused me, and the relative standing quietly near the kitchen. Neither of them had looked surprised. Not even for a second. I leaned back in my chair. That couldn't be a coincidence. Then another memory surfaced. Just before the accusation began, I'd seen that same relative leave the dining room. At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it. Now I remembered exactly where they'd gone. The study. It was a room no one had entered all afternoon. A room where important family papers, financial records, and old filing cabinets had always been kept. A chill ran through me. Had they gone there before the accusation? Or after hiding something? The more I thought about it, the more another detail came back to me. When they returned from the study, they weren't empty-handed. They were carrying a large brown envelope. I froze. The envelope. The same one that had supposedly contained the proof. Until that moment, I'd assumed it had belonged to the man accusing me. But now I wasn't so sure. What if the evidence hadn't been brought into the house? What if it had been prepared inside the house, just minutes before everyone was called together? If that was true, then the documents hadn't simply appeared. Someone had assembled them. Someone had handed them over. And someone else had delivered the performance. For the first time since my world fell apart, I wasn't chasing a rumor. I had the beginning of a timeline. And timelines have one remarkable habit. They expose people who forget that every lie has to happen in a specific order. If I could prove the order, I might finally prove the lie. That morning, I made myself one promise. I wasn't going to spend another day trying to convince people I was innocent. Innocent people argue. The truth leaves evidence. If I wanted my family to believe me again, I needed facts, not emotions. I unfolded the notepad and stared at the timeline I'd sketched across the page. The accusation. The envelope. The trip to the study. The silent nod. The reactions around the room. Everything kept leading me back to the same question. When had those papers actually been prepared? I picked up the phone and called the one person I knew would remember every detail about that gathering. My niece. The same one who had asked why everyone was only hearing the accusation now. She answered on the second ring. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. I've been thinking about yesterday. So have I replied. I need you to tell me exactly what you remember. She hesitated. I don't know if I should get involved. I understand, I said. I'm not asking you to choose sides. I'm asking you to tell me what you saw. There was another long pause. Then she took a deep breath. I remember something that didn't make sense. My heart started racing. Before everyone sat down to eat, I went looking for Aunt Carol. She continued slowly, choosing every word with care. I walked past the study, and the door wasn't completely closed. I reached for my pen. What did you see? I saw him inside. The one who accused you. That alone was enough to make me sit up straighter. But he wasn't alone. The room suddenly felt smaller. Who was with him? I couldn't see clearly, she admitted. The filing cabinet blocked most of the room. So you couldn't tell who it was? No. She stopped. But I remember hearing another voice. My grip tightened around the phone. What did they say? I only caught one sentence. She fell silent again. What sentence? I asked. I heard someone say. Make sure you put the older copies on top. Neither of us spoke. Older copies? Copies of what? Why would anyone need older copies unless they were trying to make something appear authentic? Then another memory hit me. During the gathering, the papers had looked worn. Not torn. Not damaged. Just aged. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now that detail refused to leave my mind. People trying to fake evidence often focus on the information. But people trying to sell a lie focus on appearance. I thanked my niece for her honesty. Before hanging up, she quietly said something that stayed with me. Uncle. I don't think they expected anyone to notice. After we ended the call, I spread my notes across the kitchen table again. For the first time, I wasn't looking at accusations. I was looking at preparation. Someone had thought about how the papers would look, how they would be presented, how the family would react. That wasn't something a person decided in the heat of the moment. It was something they rehearsed. Then I noticed another detail I'd written the night before. The envelope had only contained photocopies, not originals. That suddenly seemed very important. If the originals really existed, who had created the copies? As that question circled in my mind, my phone rang. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. I answered. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then an unfamiliar voice quietly said, "If you want the truth." It paused. "Stop looking at the papers." My heart pounded. "Who's this?" Another pause. Then came 6 words that changed everything. "Follow the money, not the documents." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand. Until that moment, I'd been trying to prove the evidence was fake. Now someone was telling me I was investigating the wrong thing entirely. I must have listened to that silent phone call a dozen times in my head. Follow the money, not the documents. Whoever had called me knew something. More importantly, they knew I was looking in the wrong direction. I pushed the papers aside. For the first time since the nightmare began, I stopped asking who had forged the evidence. Instead, I asked a different question. If money had really disappeared, where had it actually gone? The family emergency fund had never been a secret. Years earlier, after a series of medical emergencies and unexpected hardships, we'd all agreed to contribute whenever we could. The money wasn't controlled by one person. It required records, deposits, and careful bookkeeping. I'd helped establish those rules myself because I wanted every family member to trust the process. Which meant one thing. If someone claimed money had been stolen, there had to be records that existed long before those papers were ever printed. I drove to the local credit union where the account had always been maintained. The young woman at the front desk recognized me immediately. "I'm sorry," she said politely. "I can't release information without authorization." "I understand," I replied. "I'm not asking you to break any rules." Then I asked a question that didn't require her to reveal a single dollar amount. "Has the account always been handled the same way?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" "Were there ever any changes to who could access it?" She couldn't discuss balances. She couldn't discuss transactions. But after checking something on her computer, she looked back at me and said something I wasn't expecting. "There was an authorization update last year." Last year? My stomach tightened. That didn't make sense. The papers shown to my family claimed money had been disappearing for years. If the access rules had only changed last year, how could the story possibly fit? I thanked her and walked outside. For the first time, I had something solid. Not proof, but a contradiction. And contradictions have a way of leading to truth. Back in my car, I opened the notebook again. I drew a line through one assumption I'd been making since the gathering. The documents were not the beginning of the lie. They were the ending. The lie had started somewhere else. Someone had first needed control. Then they needed a believable story. Only after that did they need convincing paperwork. As I was writing, my phone buzzed. It was my niece. "You need to hear this," she whispered. "What happened?" I was helping Aunt Carol clean up after everyone left. My pulse quickened. And I found something in the trash. I gripped the phone tighter. What was it? A shredded envelope. I frowned. There were dozens of tiny paper strips inside. So, I started putting some of them together. My heart nearly stopped. Why would you do that? Because one piece had your name on it. I sat in complete silence. "I couldn't rebuild all of it," she continued. "But I rebuilt enough." "What did it say?" "It wasn't addressed to you. It was addressed." She hesitated. "To the man who accused you." Every muscle in my body tensed. "From who?" "I don't know." The sender's name was torn away. But there was one thing that survived. What? There was a company logo. I closed my eyes. A financial consulting firm. Not a bank. Not a law office. Not an accounting company. A financial consulting firm. Why would someone accusing me of stealing from the family receive documents from a private consulting company? Unless those papers hadn't been discovered. They had been prepared. My niece spoke again. There's something else. I waited. The envelope wasn't old. It had been mailed only 3 days before the family gathering. 3 days. Not years. 3 days. That meant whatever had happened. The final stage of the plan had been set in motion less than a week before my reputation was destroyed. I looked down at my timeline. For the first time, dates were beginning to replace guesses. And dates don't have emotions. They don't take sides. They simply tell the truth. Whoever had planned this had made one critical mistake. They'd remembered to invent a past. But they'd forgotten to hide the present. For the first time since the family gathering, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Hope. Not because I'd proved my innocence. I hadn't. But because the lie was finally beginning to show cracks. I spread everything across my dining room table. My handwritten timeline. The dates from the so-called bank records. The information my niece had remembered. The phone call. The authorization change at the credit union. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, they refused to fit the story my family had been told. I kept asking myself the same question. If someone had spent years stealing from the family fund, why would the final evidence only appear 3 days before the accusation? That wasn't how honest people exposed the truth. It was how someone prepared a performance. Then another memory surfaced. One I'd completely overlooked. About 6 months before the family gathering, the same man who accused me had insisted on becoming more involved with the family's finances. At the time, it seemed reasonable. He said he wanted to take some pressure off everyone's shoulders. I remember thanking him, even recommending that we let him help organize the records. Looking back, I had unknowingly handed him exactly what he needed. Access. I called my oldest cousin. The same cousin who had silently pushed his chair away from me that afternoon. I wasn't sure he'd even answer. To my surprise, he did. His voice was distant. What do you want? I only need you to answer one question. A long pause. Go ahead. Do you remember who suggested reorganizing the family fund last year? Silence. Not defensive silence. Thinking silence. Finally, he said, It wasn't you. No. It was him. Another pause. I'd forgotten about that. So had I. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he quietly asked, Why are you bringing this up now? Because if he controlled the records before he accused me. I let the sentence hang. He finished it himself. Then he controlled what everyone eventually saw. Exactly. For the first time since that terrible afternoon, someone else had reached the same conclusion I had. I wasn't alone anymore. Before ending the call, my cousin said something unexpected. I've still got boxes from when we reorganized everything. I sat up straight. What kind of boxes? Old binders. Receipts. Meeting notes. I never threw them away. My heart started pounding. Would you be willing to look through them? He hesitated, then quietly replied, I think I owe you that. After we hung up, I stared at the wall for several minutes. Not because I'd found proof, because I'd found something almost as valuable. The first person who had stopped believing the lie. Late that afternoon, my cousin called back. His voice sounded different. Uneasy. I found something. What is it? The meeting notes. And they don't match what everyone remembers. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? The notes clearly say that no one person was ever supposed to have full access to the emergency fund. I closed my eyes. That was exactly how we designed it years ago. So how did he end up handling everything himself? I don't know. My cousin sounded genuinely confused. But that's not the strange part. I gripped the phone tighter. Then what is? The signature approving the change. He stopped speaking. What about it? I've compared it to older documents. Another pause. It doesn't look like yours. My pulse quickened. You think it's forged? I don't know. But I know this. If someone asked me today whether I'd swear under oath that you signed it. He took a deep breath. I couldn't. For several seconds, neither of us said a word. Then he quietly added something that changed the direction of the investigation completely. There's one more name on the approval form. I frowned. What other name? It isn't a family member. That didn't make any sense. Then who is it? I've never heard of the person. He slowly read the signature aloud. The name meant nothing to me. Not then. But before the week was over, I would discover that this complete stranger had been paid thousands of dollars just days before my family gathering. And somehow, their name was connected to everything. That name meant nothing to me. I wrote it down anyway. Sometimes the smallest detail becomes the thread that unravels everything. The next morning, I drove to my cousin's house. When he opened the door, there was none of the awkwardness that had hung between us since the family gathering. Instead, he looked tired. I barely slept, he admitted. I kept asking myself one question. What question? I asked. Why didn't I ask you for your side before judging you? I wanted to tell him it was all right. It wasn't. But I also knew something more important was at stake. The truth. He led me into his garage, where several dusty storage boxes were stacked against the wall. I almost threw these away last year, he said. I'm glad you didn't. For the next 3 hours, we searched through old folders, handwritten notes, receipts, and meeting records dating back nearly a decade. Most of it meant nothing. Then my cousin stopped turning pages. Look at this. He handed me a folder labeled Family Emergency Fund, Annual Review. Inside was a checklist from the year before everything fell apart. Every person responsible for overseeing the fund had signed beside their name. Mine wasn't there. Instead, there was a note written in blue ink. Signature to be obtained later. I frowned. It never was. My cousin nodded. Exactly. If your signature was never obtained. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Then how had documents appeared months later carrying my supposed approval? Someone had filled in the missing piece after the fact. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was planning. As we continued searching, another document slipped from the folder and landed on the floor. It was an invoice. Not from a bank. Not from a lawyer. From the same financial consulting company whose logo my niece had found on the shredded envelope. My pulse quickened. The invoice wasn't addressed to the family. It was addressed to the man who had accused me. The date caught my attention immediately. 5 days before the family gathering. The amount was even more surprising. Several $1,000s. I read the description twice. Then a third time. It simply said, Document Preparation and Financial Review Services. Neither of us spoke. Finally, my cousin broke the silence. What financial review? Nobody hired a consultant. I certainly didn't, I replied. And neither did I. We looked at each other. The room suddenly felt much smaller. If no one in the family had approved this, who had? Then another detail jumped off the page. At the bottom of the invoice was a reference number. My cousin disappeared into another box. After several minutes of searching, he pulled out an old reimbursement ledger. His hands started trembling. I don't believe this. What? He turned the ledger toward me. The reference number matched. The consulting fee hadn't been paid by the man accusing me. It had been reimbursed from the Family Emergency Fund itself. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The very money I had supposedly stolen had been used to pay the company that prepared the documents, accusing me of stealing it. The irony was almost impossible to comprehend. My cousin slowly sat down. I helped approve this reimbursement. His voice cracked. I never even questioned it. I placed a hand on his shoulder. You didn't know? No, he whispered. I didn't want to know. There was a difference. He stared at the invoice for a long time before quietly saying, I owe you more than an apology. You deserve the truth. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. It was my niece. When I answered, she sounded frightened. Uncle. You need to come to Aunt Carol's house. What happened? People are arguing. About what? They've just discovered money is missing from the emergency fund. I froze. Money was already supposed to be missing. I know. Her voice shook. But this time, it disappeared after everyone blamed you. The room went silent. If money had vanished again, after I'd already been cast out, then someone had just made a mistake they could no longer blame on me. And for the first time since that terrible family gathering, the lie wasn't quietly cracking anymore. It was beginning to collapse under its own weight. By the time I pulled into my sister Carol's driveway, I could hear raised voices from inside the house. It was nothing like the family gathering where I had been accused. Back then, everyone had spoken in calm, measured tones. Now people were interrupting each other, demanding answers, questioning details they had accepted without hesitation just days earlier. I stood outside the front door for a moment. Part of me wanted to turn around. Another part knew that if I walked away now, the truth might never have another chance to be heard. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room fell silent. Some people looked embarrassed. Others couldn't meet my eyes. For the first time since my reputation had been destroyed, no one rushed to accuse me. My oldest cousin was the first to speak. We found another problem. I looked around the room. What happened? He placed the reimbursement ledger on the dining room table. The emergency fund doesn't balance. There's another withdrawal. No one can explain. The man who had accused me folded his arms. Accounting mistakes happen. His answer came too quickly, too confidently. Before anyone could respond, my cousin slid the consulting company's invoice across the table. I found this too. The room grew quiet again. My brother picked it up first. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he read the date aloud. 5 days before the family gathering. He looked at the man who had accused me. Why were you paying a financial consulting company? I wasn't. You were reimbursed, my cousin corrected, from the emergency fund. A murmur spread through the room. The man shrugged. They were helping organize paperwork. Who approved that? My sister asked. No answer. Who hired them? My brother added. Still no answer. For the first time, the questions were no longer directed at me. They were directed at him. He tried to regain control. You're all getting distracted, he said. This doesn't change what he did. Then he pointed at me again. It was the same tactic that had worked only days earlier. Only this time. No one turned to look at me. Everyone kept looking at him. My niece quietly broke the silence. I've been thinking about something. She reached into her purse and removed her phone. I took pictures that afternoon. The room looked at her in confusion. I wasn't taking pictures of the meeting. I was taking pictures of the kids. She scrolled through several photos before stopping. This was taken about 10 minutes before the accusation. She handed the phone to my brother. His eyebrows rose. What is it? Someone asked. He turned the screen toward the rest of us. In the background of the photo, barely visible through the open study door, were two figures. The man who had accused me, and the same relative I'd seen standing in the kitchen. Between them sat the large brown envelope. Neither of them looked surprised. Neither of them looked worried. They looked busy, preparing something. The room became uncomfortably still. My brother zoomed in. The timestamp. He looked back at everyone. This photo was taken before any of us were called into the dining room. No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Then my older sister asked the question that changed everything. If the evidence was already laid out before the accusation. She slowly turned toward him. When exactly did you discover all of this? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time since this nightmare began. He had no prepared answer. His eyes searched the room, almost as if looking for someone to rescue him. Then I noticed it. The same relative from the kitchen quietly stood up. Without saying a single word, they walked toward the hallway. Not toward the front door. Not toward the family. Toward the back of the house. As if they were trying to leave without anyone noticing. I watched them disappear around the corner. And in that moment, I knew something the rest of my family hadn't realized yet. One person had just lost control of the lie. The other person was trying to escape it. The moment that family member slipped into the hallway, I knew they weren't leaving because they were angry. They were leaving because they were afraid. Before anyone else noticed, I quietly followed. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was chasing the truth. The hallway was empty. A second later, I heard a door close. It was the small home office at the back of the house. I stopped outside. The voices inside were low, but not low enough. "It's over," someone whispered. "We should have destroyed everything." Then came the voice I'd been hearing in my nightmares ever since the family gathering. "Calm down. We don't know what they actually have." I felt my heart pounding so hard I was certain they could hear it through the door. Another voice answered. "They've got the invoice." A long silence followed. Then I heard something that made every piece of the puzzle begin to fall into place. It was supposed to be simple. Blame him. Take control of the fund. And no one would have questioned the property transfer. Property transfer? For a moment I thought I'd misheard. Then the second voice spoke again. The money was never the real goal. We only needed everyone to stop trusting him. My entire body went cold. The emergency fund had never been the real target. It had been the distraction. The real objective had been something much larger. As the oldest member of the family still handling several shared properties, my opinion carried weight whenever major decisions had to be made. Without my signature, nothing important could move forward. But if my family believed I was dishonest, they'd never question removing me from those decisions. They'd do it themselves. Suddenly, every strange moment over the past year made sense. The sudden interest in reorganizing financial records, the consulting company, the forged emails, the rehearsed accusation. None of it had been about proving I stole money. It had been about making sure no one trusted me enough to ask questions. Before I could process another thought, my phone vibrated. It was my niece. "Where are you?" I quickly typed back. "Hallway." Her reply came instantly. "Don't move." A few seconds later, she appeared around the corner. She looked at me, then quietly held up her phone. I started recording when I saw them leave. My eyes widened. "You recorded them?" She nodded. "I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough." She pressed play. The recording was faint, muffled, but one sentence came through with perfect clarity. "Once his name is ruined, the property will be easy." Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. For the first time since this nightmare began, we weren't relying on suspicion. We had their own words. Just then the office door opened. The two of them stepped into the hallway. The moment they saw us standing there, their faces changed. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Fear. Real fear. The man who had accused me tried to force a smile. "You've got the wrong idea." I looked him straight in the eyes. For the first time since this all began, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I simply asked one question. "What property were you talking about?" His smile disappeared. Neither of them answered. Behind us, footsteps echoed down the hallway. The rest of the family had heard the voices, and were coming to see what was happening. The two people who had controlled the story from the very beginning suddenly found themselves trapped. There was nowhere left to go, nowhere left to hide. And for the first time, they were the ones desperately searching for an explanation. The footsteps grew louder. Within seconds, the rest of the family filled the hallway. No one knew exactly what they had walked into. They only knew something had changed. My niece took a slow breath and held up her phone. "I think everyone needs to hear this." The man who had accused me immediately stepped forward. "That's private. It has nothing to do with anyone else." My brother looked at him. "It became everyone's business the moment you accused him in front of the whole family." No one argued. My niece pressed play. The hallway became perfectly still. The recording wasn't crystal clear. There were moments of static. A few words were impossible to make out. But then came the sentence no one could misunderstand. "Once his name is ruined, the property will be easy." The recording ended. No one spoke. The silence was heavier than any shouting could have been. My younger sister was the first to break it. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at him. "What property?" He swallowed. It isn't what it sounds like." My oldest cousin shook his head. "Then tell us what it is." Again. No answer. For days, he'd had an explanation for everything. Now when the questions were aimed at him, he had nothing. My brother slowly turned toward the other family member, who had stood quietly in the kitchen during the gathering. You knew. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Tears filled their eyes. I never wanted it to go this far. The words echoed through the hallway. Several relatives gasped. My niece covered her mouth. My sister took a step backward. You knew, she whispered. I was told no one would get hurt, they said, struggling to speak. I was told we'd only make him step away from the family finances for a while. And you believed that? My cousin asked. I wanted to. Their shoulders slumped. They said if he stayed in control of everything, the property would never be sold, and none of us would receive our share. Every face in the hallway slowly turned toward me. For years, I'd refused to sell the old family land. Not because I wanted control. Because it wasn't just land. It was where my parents had built their first home. It was where my grandparents were buried. It was the place every generation of our family had returned to for reunions, birthdays, and holidays. I'd always believed some things were worth more than money. Apparently, not everyone agreed. The man who had accused me finally spoke again. You don't understand. No, my brother replied quietly. I think we finally do. He looked around at everyone gathered there. We spent days questioning the wrong person. Those words should have felt like victory. Instead, they only made me tired. The anger I'd carried since the family gathering was gone. In its place was something far heavier. Disappointment. Not because strangers had believed a lie. Because my own family had. Without asking. Without doubting. Without giving me the chance to defend myself. My youngest granddaughter slowly walked out from behind her mother. She looked up at me with the same uncertain eyes I'd seen a few days earlier. This time, she didn't stop halfway across the room. She walked straight to me. She reached for my hand. Then she asked the simplest question anyone had asked since this nightmare began. Grandpa, you didn't lie, did you? I knelt down and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. No, sweetheart. I never did. She wrapped her little arms around my neck. I knew it. I closed my eyes. Of every moment that had happened since my reputation was destroyed, that embrace meant the most. But before anyone could say another word, my oldest cousin quietly cleared his throat. He was holding a folder he'd found among the old family records. I think everyone should see this. He slowly opened it. Inside was a document none of us remembered signing. At the bottom, waiting for approval, was a property transfer agreement. And beside the space where my signature should have been, someone had already practiced writing my name. No one moved. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the signature at the bottom of that property transfer agreement. For a long moment, the room was completely silent. Then my older brother slowly reached for the folder. He compared the signature on the transfer agreement to the signature on one of the supposed bank documents. His face turned pale. They're the same. No one had to ask what he meant. The same unnatural curve. The same awkward spacing. The same tiny mistake repeated in both signatures. It wasn't just similar. It had been copied. The man who had accused me finally lowered his head. For days, he had an answer for every question. This time, he had none. My cousin quietly picked up the consulting company's invoice and placed it beside the property agreement. Then he looked around the room. I think we've seen enough. One by one, the pieces finally fit together. The false accusation. The forged emails. The rehearsed performance. The consulting company. The fabricated documents. The attempt to remove me from decisions involving the family property. None of it had been about protecting the family. It had been about controlling it. My younger sister walked over to me. She couldn't hold back her tears. I'm so sorry. Her voice trembled. I should have asked you before believing any of it. I gently nodded. I wish you had. She buried her face in my shoulder and cried. A few moments later, my oldest cousin stepped forward. I owe you an apology too. So do I, my brother said quietly. Then another voice joined in. And another. One after another. The same people who had once looked at me with doubt now stood before me carrying the weight of their own regret. The room that had once judged me had become a room full of people confronting themselves. Finally, the man who had started it all slowly walked toward me. He looked nothing like the confident person who had stood before the family days earlier. His shoulders were slumped. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me." I was desperate. I convinced myself that if I could just get control of the property, I could fix my own problems. He wiped away a tear. But every lie demanded another one. And before I knew it, I'd destroyed the person who had helped me more than anyone else. I looked at him for a long time. The strange thing was, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had kept me awake for days. The truth had finally allowed it to rest. But forgiveness, that was something different. "I won't spend the rest of my life hating you," I said quietly. "Hate only gives the past another place to live." He slowly looked up. "But forgiveness isn't something you ask for because you've been caught. It's something you earn by accepting every consequence of what you've done." He nodded. There was nothing he could say. Some wounds heal. Others become reminders. Not to make us bitter, but to make us wiser. In the weeks that followed, the forged documents were turned over to the proper authorities, the property transfer was permanently cancelled, and new safeguards were put in place so no one person could ever again control the family's finances or important decisions alone. The consulting company was investigated, and the documents they had prepared became part of the evidence that exposed the entire scheme. The people who had participated in the deception faced the consequences of their choices, while the family worked to rebuild trust one honest conversation at a time. As for me, I was asked to take my place back at the head of the family meetings. I thanked them. Then I surprised everyone. I declined. Respect isn't restored by returning to the same chair. It's restored when people finally understand why they should never have taken it away. Instead, I suggested something we'd never done before. Every important family decision would be made together. Every financial record would be open for everyone to review. Every question would be welcomed. Because secrets had nearly destroyed us. Transparency might finally heal us. A few months later, we gathered once again at the same house. The same dining room. The same table. The same family. Only one thing was different. Before anyone sat down to eat, my youngest granddaughter walked over, slipped her little hand into mine and smiled. "Grandpa, I knew you were telling the truth." I smiled back. So did I. In that moment, I realized something I'd spent far too long searching for. Karma isn't always watching someone lose everything. Sometimes, it's watching the truth quietly reclaim everything a lie tried to steal. And if this story teaches us anything, it's this. The strongest families are not the ones that never face betrayal. They're the ones that learn never to mistake confidence for truth, never to judge before listening, and never to let greed speak louder than the people who have spent a lifetime proving their love.